Oh, I forgot to change the orientation on this recording, so forgive me for a minute while I try to screw with this dang tablet to make it hold. There we go. Get you back down where you need to be a little bit there. This is going to be the death of me. Bear with me for a second. Just raise it up a little higher. All right, we'll go with that for now. My goodness. All right. How are y'all doing this evening? Pain in my butt already, this dang thing here. I'm bringing it around this way. Kind of stuck in here to the... Let me try and fix this before I start this thing. Maybe that did it. Much better. Okay. All right. Oh, my goodness. Rough start, but we're going to get after it. This week's episode is brought to you by Deep Roots Rifle Company. Elevated excellence rooted in integrity and reliability. And hop over to their website listed in the podcast description and check out all their offerings, from a fully custom rifle built in-house to tuck and turkey decoys and everything in between. Make sure you use code UPO10 at checkout to get 10% off your next order. They got some awesome stuff over there. So go check it out. See what they got. Kind of stuck here tonight at the dining room table because it's pouring rain outside. There you see the lightning flashing behind me, getting a cold front coming through. And we're getting some much needed rain, although not enough of it. This is another one of these sweet hats that we should have coming in from Mount Dora Laser Printing. This is an auto, and this is actually like the old style foam front style trucker hat. And this is just printed on here. This is going to be one of our less expensive options. I know last week we had a patch. I had a patch hat on, but these are cool. I'm kind of right now just testing durability to see how well all this holds up, because I know these are cheaper hats, but I've had auto hats before that held up really, really well. So we'll see how this one does. And then these will be, like I said, a lot cheaper on our website. They're cool. They're fun little hats. Is what it is. But their quality is still, I know Laser Printing is doing a great job making these for us. So for those that don't know, Milo Hanson just recently passed away, 1925. Or he was born in 1925 to 2025. That's not true. He wasn't that old. He was 81 when he passed away. Was a Canadian hunter and a farmer of Biggar, Saskatchewan, best known for harvesting the world record typical whitetail deer in 1993. This buck, taken near his home, was officially scored at 213 5/8 inches by the Boone and Crockett Club, and has remained the world record typical whitetail ever since. A humble outdoorsman, lifelong advocate for ethical, fair chase hunting, Hanson became a respected figure in the hunting community, symbolizing patience, stewardship, and deep respect for wildlife and land. And if you're a whitetail hunter, there are certain names that don't just sit in record books. They echo. They get whispered in deer camps. They get debated over coffee. They get brought up every single time somebody says, "What's the biggest one ever killed?" I'm going to turn this way. And whether you're in Georgia, Florida, Saskatchewan, or sitting in a Midwest tree stand in November wind, the name always surfaces: Milo Hanson. Now, if you're new to the game, or maybe you've heard the name but never really dug into it, today we're going to slow this down and tell it the right way. Because recently the man behind the legend passed away. And when someone like that leaves us, you don't just mention the rack score and move on. You tell the story. You tell it fully, you tell it accurately, and you tell it with respect. Milo Hanson wasn't some celebrity hunter. He wasn't chasing fame, and he wasn't running trail cameras across 10,000 acres. He wasn't building a brand. He was a Saskatchewan farmer, a regular guy who happened to step into one of the most legendary moments in North American hunting history. So let's rewind to November of 1993. Saskatchewan, Canada. Cold, open, big country. If you never hunted up there, it's hard to understand how vast it feels. Not just woods, but farmland broken by brush, aspen groves, shelter belts, rolling prairie cut with timber fingers that funnel deer like highways. And in November, especially rifle season, it becomes a chessboard. The rut is winding down. Big bucks are tired. They've been chasing. They've been fighting. They're worn down. They're vulnerable, but they're still ghosts. And this buck, the buck, had been seen before. Locals knew there was a giant in the area. That right there is important. This wasn't a fairy tale where a random unknown deer materialized out of thin air. People had caught glimpses. Neighbors talked. Farmers had mentioned a massive typical whitetail roaming the section, but no one had sealed the deal. And that's how it goes with giants. They don't survive by accident. On November 23rd, 1993, Milo was doing what he had done countless times before, pushing brush with his family members. Not sitting in a heated blind, not running food plots. They were organizing a drive, and that's something I still have yet to be able to do, but I would love to do that. A deer drive. I think it's probably more common in the Midwest. We don't do it a lot here in the South, although we do use dogs. So it's sort of like deer driving, but you're man driving, not using hounds. Now, for some of us Southern guys listening, deer drives may not be your thing, but in the big northern country, organized pushes through timber patches are traditional and effective. So Milo positioned himself strategically. And then it happened. The push began, the buck broke cover, and here's where the legend becomes human again. This wasn't a 400-yard cross-canyon shot. It was a cinematic slow motion. It wasn't cinematic slow motion. It was fast, real fast. The buck appeared, moving. Milo fired, the deer went down. And just like that, no idea yet what he had just done. No dramatic orchestral music. Just another deer on the ground during rifle season until they walked up, and that's when the air changes. Now, I've heard the story that he actually shot the deer, dropped it, but didn't make a good shot and actually shot it again after it hit the ground. I don't know the truth behind that. Never spoke to the man himself, but I've read several different accounts on doing this, but we'll give you what it is. Because every experienced hunter knows the difference between a good buck and what in the world is that. They walked up to a typical whitetail frame so clean, so symmetrical, so heavy that even before a tape measure touched bone, they knew it was different. Main beams sweeping long and strong, tines standing tall, mass that carried all the way out. No junk, no wild trash, just a towering textbook typical frame. Now let's talk numbers, because eventually numbers matter. After official scoring, though, through Boone and Crockett Club, the buck netted 213 5 5/8 inches typical. Listen again. 213 5/8 inches typical. Not non-typical, typical. For perspective, the previous long-standing world record, typical, was the legendary James Jordan buck taken in 1914 in Wisconsin, scoring 206 1/8 of an inch. That record stood for nearly 80 years. 8 decades. World wars happened. Presidents came and went. Generations of hunters lived and died, and that record stood untouched. Until a farmer in Saskatchewan shot a buck on a push in 1993. Now, here's something important for you guys to understand. This wasn't high fence. This wasn't managed for antler growth with modern mineral programs. This was wild northern genetics meeting age, nutrition, and protection in a landscape that allowed deer to grow old. The buck was estimated to be about 8.5 years old. Think about that. 8.5 years of surviving winters that would crush most deer. 8.5 years of dodging hunters, 8.5 years of rut battles. You don't stumble into that by accident. And when the score was finalized, the hunting world shifted because records matter. You can't say they don't, but they do. Or you can say they don't, but they do. They're benchmarks, they're milestones. They're proof of what's possible in wild places. The Milo Hanson buck became the new world record typical whitetail, and it still stands today. Over 3 decades later. Think about that in modern context. Trail cameras everywhere, intensive management everywhere, advanced optics, better bullets, better mapping, more hunters than ever. I wouldn't say more hunters than ever. And that 1993 buck is still on top. More hunters actively chasing big deer than ever, I would say. Would be a better way to put that. Now let's pause here for a second, because it's easy to reduce this to inches and numbers. But what made Milo's story resonate wasn't just the rack. It was the man. By all accounts, Milo Hanson remained humble. He didn't chase speaking tours. He didn't act like royalty. He was proud, yes, but grounded. And when you hear interviews with him, there's something steady about him. Matter of fact, grateful, not boastful. He understood that he had been part of something rare, but he never pretended he engineered it. And that right there is something our modern hunting culture could chew on for a minute. Because today, everything is curated. Everything is branded. Everything is content. In 1993, this was just a hunt. A cold November day, family pushing brush, a buck breaks, a shot rings out, and history changes. When news spread, it wasn't social media. It was magazine covers. It was word of mouth. It was printed score sheets. And slowly the name Milo Hanson became synonymous with the pinnacle of typical whitetail hunting. But with records come questions. When a record stands for nearly 80 years and then suddenly falls, the reaction isn't applause, it's scrutiny. It's magnifying glasses, it's side-eye conversations at deer camp, because hunters by nature are skeptical creatures. We measure twice, we second guess, and we look for flaws. And when the buck taken by Milo Hanson was submitted to the Boone and Crockett Club, the measuring process was not casual. It never is. Boone and Crockett doesn't just slap a tape on antlers and call it a day. There's a mandatory 60-day drying period, multiple certified measurers, independent verification, paperwork, signatures, final panel review, especially when you're talking about a potential world record. Now let's walk through how typical scoring works, because this matters. In a typical whitetail rack, symmetry is king. Main beams, tine length, mash measurements at 4 circumferences per side, inside spread. Abnormal points are deducted. Read that again, deducted. And typical scoring rewards clean, balanced frames. If a buck throws stickers, kickers, or drop tines, those don't help you in the typical category. They actually subtract from your final net, which makes what Milo Hanson shot even more impressive, because the frame was almost absurdly clean. Long main beams pushing past 28 inches, G2s and G3s towering well over 12 inches, and masts that didn't fade off into pencil tips. An inside spread of over 27 inches, gross score, meaning before deductions, was astronomical. After symmetry deductions, it still landed at 213 and 5/8 inches net typical. That number matters because net is what counts in Boone and Crockett's all-time book. Not gross, net. Now, personally, I think nets are for fishing, but, this is Boone and Crockett's book. For comparison, the legendary James Jordan buck from 1914 scored 206 and 1/8 inches. That deer stood alone in the record book through 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the rise of modern conservation, and the explosion of televised hunting. And now, 1993, a new name topped that list. When the final panel confirmed the score, the hunting world shifted. Magazine covers featured the rack, outdoor writers just dissected the numbers, and just as predictably, whispers started. Was it really fair chase? Was it fed? Was it fenced? Was there something unusual about the genetics? Here's the reality. The deer was taken during an organized drive on an open farmland in Saskatchewan. Free range, wild. Legal season, legal weapon, no high fence, no exotic genetic programs. Ooh, there's a good one. And remember, in 1993, the high fence industry was nowhere near what it would later become in parts of North America. But skepticism is part of record breaking. Even the Jordan buck faced its own debates back in the early 1900s. Big numbers make people uncomfortable because they redefine ceilings. And when ceilings move, hunters recalibrate what's possible. Now let's talk about why Saskatchewan. Because geography isn't random. Story. Saskatchewan sits in a sweet spot of northern whitetail habitat. Long winters, short growing seasons, agricultural food sources like canola, wheat, barley, thick aspen and willow bedding cover, low human density compared to much of the United States, and historically lighter hunting pressure per square mile than heavily populated states. That combination allows deer, especially bucks, to age. And age is everything. You and I both know a 4-year-old buck can look impressive, but a true 8-year-old northern whitetail, that's a different animal. Heavy forehead, Roman nose, thick bases, body like a small elk. The Milo buck shot was estimated to be around 8.5 years old, like we said earlier, which means he had survived 8 Canadian winters. Let that sink in. Northern winters aren't inconveniences, they're tests. Deep snow limits movement. Cold burns calories. Predation increases when deer yard up. Only the strongest, smartest deer consistently make it through. And that buck wasn't just genetically gifted, he was a survivor. Now here's where the cultural impact begins. Because after 1993, something subtle changed in whitetail hunting psychology. Hunters began to believe that the Jordan buck was untouchable. For 80 years, it felt mythical, like Babe Ruth's home run record once did in baseball. And then suddenly, a modern hunter had surpassed it, and that lit a fire. Throughout the late 90s and early 2000s, interest in trophy management exploded. Quality deer management associations grew. Let young buck walk became a movement. Trail camera technology accelerated. Research increased, and hunters started paying closer attention to age structure. Now, to be clear, none of that was caused solely by the Hanson buck, but it was a landmark moment during a time when a whitetail culture was evolving. And the image of that clean, towering, typical rack became the gold standard. When someone says perfect whitetail, most people picture something very close to that frame. Tall, wide, balanced, textbook, but there's something that often gets overlooked. Milo Hanson didn't set out that morning to chase a world record. He wasn't hunting for inches. He wasn't calculating score in his head. He was participating in a family deer drive, and that matters. Because sometimes the biggest stories in hunting don't start with obsession, they start with tradition. Family members space through brush, walkers pushing, standers waiting, cold breath in the air, snow crutching under boots, a rifle held ready, and a buck breaking cover. That simplicity is part of why the story endures. Now let's address something else. Whenever a new record is set, the immediate question becomes, how long will it stand? In 1993, nobody could have confidently predicted that more than 30 years later, the Milo Hanson buck would still sit at number 1 in the typical category. We should have some of these hats coming in soon, Tyke and Jake. These will be pretty cheap. These are pretty awesome, though. In 1993, nobody could have confidently predicted that more than 30 years later, the Milo Hanson buck would still sit at number 1 in the typical category. Because since then, we've seen giants, the Missouri Monarchs, the Iowa Legends, massive managed deer from the Midwest, and yes, even larger non-typicals like the famous Missouri pickup buck that shattered records in a different category. But typical, clean, symmetrical, Boone and Crockett typical, Milo's buck remains king. And that longevity adds weight to the story. It wasn't a fluke year. It wasn't a temporary spike. It was an immediate. It wasn't immediately eclipsed. It endured. Now, as news of Milo's recent passing spread, something interesting happened online in the hunting circles. People didn't argue about inches. They shared gratitude. They shared photos. They told stories of meeting him at shows. They described him as humble, soft-spoken, and approachable. And in an era where hunting personalities can sometimes feel larger than life or larger than ego, that humility stands out. He carried the world record typical whitetail for over 3 decades, and yet by most accounts he carried it lightly. And that's rare. When the shot echoed across the Saskatchewan farmland on November 23, 1993, nobody knew the ripple it would create. Not Milo, not his family, not the neighbors who had heard rumors of a giant typical slipping through shelter belts and aspen bluffs. But word travels fast in rural country. And when the rack was loaded up and brought for a closer look, conversation started immediately. You've been there. You shoot a good buck, it gets better the longer you stare at it, then someone says, that might be special. In Milo's case, special turned into something far bigger. Within days, local hunters were coming to see it. Then regional attention followed. And once official measures began looking closely, the tone shifted. This wasn't just big for Saskatchewan. This was historic. Now let's slow down and actually visualize this deer, because numbers are one thing, but structure tells a story. The buck carried incredibly long main beams, stretching past 28 inches each. That beam length most hunters will never see. It's a beam length most hunters will never see in person. That's huge. The inside spread of this buck is over 27 inches. I mean, you're talking a buck that's like, I can't even get my hands on camera because it's facing the wrong direction, but length. Both G2s and G3s soared well into the 12-inch range. The G4s stood tall and clean, no crab claws, no wild kickers, no abnormal trash to subtract, just symmetry. And that symmetry is what separates giants in the typical category. Because Boone and Crockett's system, governed by the Boone and Crockett Club, doesn't reward chaos. It rewards balance. Every difference between left and right is measured and deducted. And when the final tally settled at 213 and 5/8 inches, the hunting community had to recalibrate what perfect meant. Now let's compare structure for a moment. The long-standing 1914 giant, the James Jordan buck, had a remarkable mass and beautiful form, but slightly shorter beams and less total tine length than Milo's deer. Jordan's buck stood as a symbol of the early conservation era whitetails, taken in Wisconsin when deer populations were just beginning to rebound from overharvest of the late 1800s. Milo's buck, nearly 80 years later, represented something different. It represented mature deer in an agricultural northern ecosystem thriving under modern wildlife management principles. And that contrast is important because it highlights the success of conservation. Hunters funded it, licensed dollars built it, and regulations protected age classes. And in 1993, that system produced the largest typical whitetail ever recorded. Now here's something fascinating. After the official panel confirmed the score, Saskatchewan's reputation exploded. American hunters began looking north with renewed intensity. Outfitters saw increased inquiries. Applications for Canadian hunts rose because hunters chased two things relentlessly: possibility and proof. And the Hanson buck was proof. Proof that giants still existed. Proof that the mythical ceiling had moved. And for many hunters in the 90s, that changed long-term goals. Before that moment, breaking 200 inches typical felt almost unreachable in the modern era. After it, it felt rare, but possible. And when something feels possible, behavior changes. More hunters passed young bucks. More landowners discussed management. More conversations happened about age structure. So let's talk about the man again. Because it wouldn't have been easy, very easy. It would have been easy, very easy for Milo Hanson to become defined solely by antler inches. But by all accounts, he didn't chase the spotlight. He attended events. When invited. He answered questions, and he posed for photos. But he didn't build an empire around the rack. He remained a farmer, a family man, and a hunter. And that grounded nature is part of why his recent passing resonated so strongly. When news broke that Milo Hanson had passed away, the response wasn't controversy, it was appreciation. Hunters shared stories of meeting him at trade shows. They described him as humble, approachable, steady, and maybe that's fitting, because the buck itself wasn't chaotic or wild-looking. It was steady, balanced, measured. There's a poetic symmetry here. Now let's discuss something that always floats beneath the record discussion. Luck versus intention. Was Milo lucky? Of course. Every successful hunt carries some degree of timing and opportunity, but luck alone doesn't explain 8.5 years of survival in Saskatchewan winters. It doesn't explain positioning correctly during a drive. It doesn't explain making the shot when seconds matter. Preparation and luck often meet in the same moment, and in 1993 they collided. There was also something worth reflecting on how the deer was taken. Not over a food plot, not patterning trail camera photos for weeks, not micromanaging wind thermals from a saddle, but a traditional push, family working together, walkers and standers, boot leather, and cold air. In today's hyper-individualized hunting culture, that detail stands out. The world record typical whitetail wasn't a solo YouTube episode. It was a shared effort. And that communal aspect feels increasingly rare. So now let's fast forward to today. Over 30 years later, the Milo Hanson buck still sits at the top of the typical category. And we've seen massive deer since. We've seen management produce giants, and we've seen non-typicals obliterate score sheets, including deer like the legendary Missouri pickup buck. Pickup buck. But clean, symmetrical, net typical, number one remains unchanged. And every year that passes adds weight to the fact, because records that endure become mythic. The longer they stand, the more they transform from big deer to era-defining deer. And that's where we are now. This buck is no longer just an entry in a book. It's a benchmark, a measuring stick. A story told to young hunters who ask, what's the biggest one ever? I've got one like that. The boys reach, when you're new in it, you reach a point where you just want to know, well, what's the biggest deer ever killed? It's the Milo Hanson buck. The biggest typical deer. And now with Milo passing, it's also become a legendary, a legacy marker. The rack will outlive all of us, but the score will remain inked in record books. But the man behind it, the steady farmer who stepped into history on a cold November day, he's gone. And that shifts the tone. When a world record stands for more than 30 years, it stops being just a number. It becomes a reference point, a symbol, a story passed down. And the buck taken by Milo Hanson has crossed that threshold. It's no longer just the largest typical whitetail ever recorded by the Boone and Crockett Club. It's part of hunting folklore. But here's a question worth asking on a podcast like this. What does it actually represent? Because if we reduce it to 213 and 5/8 inches, we miss the point. Yes, the score matters. Records are benchmarks. They show what's biologically possible in wild North American habitat. They validate conservation success. They inspire hunters, but numbers alone don't create legacy. People do. And Milo's legacy isn't just that he shot the biggest net typical whitetail in history. In fact, it's how he carried that. For over 3 decades, the Milo Hanson buck sat at the top of the book. Every year, new giants are measured. Every winter, someone somewhere whispered, this might break the typical record. And every time the dust settled, Milo's buck still remained. Still number one, still unmatched. The king of longevity does something psychologically to hunters. It creates a North Star. When someone says world record typical, there's no debate, there's no footnote, there's no split category. It's one name. And when you carry that title for 30 plus years without ego swallowing you whole, that says something about your character. Now let's zoom out. Modern hunting culture is loud. It's competitive. It's documented in high definition. Social media can turn a decent buck into a viral event overnight. Sponsors, brand deals, merch, ego inflation, and none of that existed in 1993 the way it does now. Milo Hanson didn't step into a content machine. He stepped into history quietly. And maybe that's part of why his story feels different. There was no strategy behind it, no pursuit of record, no obsession with tape measure before the shot, just a hunter participating in a family drive in Saskatchewan. That matters. Because sometimes the biggest achievement in life comes when you're not chasing the spotlight. You just showed up, prepared, present, and doing what you've always done. And then lightning strikes, bam, like it just did outside a minute ago. Now, let's talk about something that can make people uncomfortable. Records can distort perspective. If we're not careful, we start measuring our hunting seasons against impossible standards. We start believing success equals inches, and we start forgetting why we started. The vast majority of us will never see a 200-inch typical. Most of us won't see a 180-inch deer in the wild. And that's okay, because hunting isn't a scoreboard competition unless we make it one. The reason the Hanson buck inspires isn't because it makes every other deer feel small. It inspires because it proves that wild places can produce when conservation works. Because remember, the existence of that deer is proof of habitat, age structure management, and funding all aligning. It traces back to conservation pioneers like Theodore Roosevelt. See, there's lightning striking. And organizations like the Boone and Crockett Club, who fought to protect wildlife long before Milo ever shouldered a rifle. The record is a byproduct of that system, and that's something worth honoring. Now, as we reflect on Milo's passing, there's a shift that happens naturally. When a record holder is alive, the story feels current. You can shake his hand, you can hear him tell it. You can ask him what the day felt like. When he passes, the story transitions from living memory to preserved history, and that's where we are now. The rack remains, the measurements remain, but the storyteller is gone. Which means it's up to the hunting community to carry it accurately, to tell it truthfully, to remember that it wasn't taken on a high fence, it wasn't engineered in a lab, and it wasn't manipulated for headlines. It was a free-range Saskatchewan whitetail that reached 8.5 years old in a brutal northern winters and stepped into a shooting lane during a family drive. That's the story. Simple, powerful, and human. Now let's consider something else. The previous benchmark before Milo was the James Jordan buck from 1914. That deer stood for nearly 80 years. 80, which means there are hunters who were born after 1914 lived full lives and died and never seeing that record broken. Think about that span. Now fast forward. It's been over 30 years since Milo's buck was confirmed. Will it stand for another 10, another 20, another 50? We don't know. Maybe somewhere right now in a patch overlooked timber, a clean typical is growing beans that will challenge it. Maybe the modern habitat management will produce it. Maybe climate shifts will influence nutrition and growth, or maybe, just maybe, the perfect storm will produce that 213 5/8 inch net typical that was rare enough that we won't see it surpassed for a very long time. And there's something poetic about that uncertainty, because hunting isn't guaranteed. Records aren't guaranteed. Giant deer aren't guaranteed. That's unpredictability as part of the pool. Legacy isn't built the day you pull the trigger. It's built in how you live after. By all accounts, Milo Hanson handled the fame with steadiness. He didn't weaponize it. He didn't inflate it. He didn't treat other hunters like they were beneath him because their deer scored less. He simply answered questions and went back to living his life. That humility is rare and it's instructive. Because someday, whether it's a record book buck or not, each of us will shoot a deer that becomes the one. The story we tell for decades. The mount our kids grow up staring at, the memory that anchors the season. And when that happens, the real measures won't be inches, it'll be gratitude. Now, as we close this tribute, let's picture it one more time. Late November, Saskatchewan. Cold air, family members spaced through timber, a push underway, brush crackling, a mature buck breaking from cover, a rifle shot, snow settling, boots crunching closer, and then that moment, the walk-up. Antlers rising from white ground, mass, length, symmetry. A hunter realizing something extraordinary just happened. Not because he chased a record, but because he showed up on a cold morning like he had countless times before. That's the story. And now with Milo Hanson gone, that story becomes part of hunting's permanent fabric. The rack will continue to be displayed, the score will continue to be cited, and young hunters will continue to Google world record typical whitetail, and the answer will still be the same. But hopefully, when they hear the name, they won't just think of a number. They'll think of humility, tradition, family, conservation, and the reminder that sometimes the biggest moments in hunting and in life come quietly. So, rest easy, Milo. Your buck changed record books, but your example changed something bigger, and that's what endures. So, that's all I got. It's quite a buck. And from what I've read and understood, Milo was quite a man. So, may he rest in peace. And as much as I'd love to see his record live for another 50 years, records are meant to be broken. And that'd be cool to see another one. I'd like to see another big buck come out of it. But till then, till next week, I'll keep you guys updated on these hats. Hopefully we'll get some more in soon. We'll get them up on our website. We'll see you. Adios.